Welcome to Perfection's Clutch Installation Lab. This is a 2008 Dodge Ram 3500 with the 6.7 liter Cummins turbo diesel. This truck has the 6-speed manual transmission. This truck has about 99,000 plus miles on it. The owner does tow a trailer for his business. He also pulls in some hills around where he lives. So he's reported that as he goes up a hill or has a good heavy load behind him, as he accelerates, the RPMs are increasing and the miles per hour just isn't keeping up with the torque created by this Cummins. The clutch is slipping. Now, when Dodge started using the G56 transmission in about mid-2005, they stopped using a solid flywheel and a traditional clutch, and they went to a dual mass flywheel coupled with a self-adjusting clutch. That's what this truck has, and we're going to remove that dual mass flywheel, self-adjusting clutch, and replace it with a solid flywheel Perfection conversion system. The technique we're going to use to remove and replace this clutch would apply to the G56 manual transmissions that Dodge has used since about mid-2005. So let me show you a little different way to take a transmission and a clutch out on one of these trucks. Now, while the truck was on the ground, I went ahead and took the entire stick shift out, and that hole in the transmission, covered it up with clean shop rags so no debris, tools, anything gets down inside of this transmission. This one's also four-wheel drive, so we're going to have to deal with the transfer case and the front drive shaft, but everything's looking real good. So now what we're going to do, we're going to go ahead and prepare the entire transmission for removal, but we're not going to remove the transmission. So I'm going to clear everything off of it that I need to. And then I'll show you how we're going to take this original equipment dual mass flywheel off with a little bit different approach. In almost all other cases, you remove the transmission by itself and then come back and take the clutch and the flywheel off. In this case, Dodge built the truck a little bit differently. They attached the flywheel to kind of a flex plate, but it doesn't have a ring gear on it. The ring gear is on the flywheel. So the bolts are actually up here in about the same area configuration as an automatic transmission torque converter would be. So you loosen these two screws, take this plate, and slide it off to the side. Now, we supply a barring tool in the kit. The barring tool we put in this hole right here, and the teeth on the tool line up with the teeth on the ring gear of the flywheel. So we're going to put an 1.1/8" socket on here, run some extensions and a U-joint out to the front end, and I'll be able to turn the engine over, because up here in this hole is where the bolt is going to show up. That's the bolt I need to remove to get this flywheel off and take the system off as one piece with the transmission. Now I'm using the barring tool to rotate the engine, and you can see the bolt appear. I'll take all 8 bolts out, and then we'll be ready to take the transmission off. Okay, this is the last bolt. Cross members removed, transmission mount's gone, last bolt coming out. Now we're just going to start to take the transmission back, tip it back a little bit. Right there, you can see the pilot of the back of the flywheel. So now we're just going to come down. And there's the entire transmission and dual mass flywheel coming out as one piece. Now, this flywheel and clutch assembly weighs about 100 pounds. So to handle it, we put 2 bolts in the kit. So just thread the bolts in about the 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock position. Get a good bite on it. And this is Tim. He works in our clutch testing lab and does a lot of great things around here. So he's volunteered to help slide this off. And put on a cart. That's how you remove it as one piece. That's how we're going to install the new system, just about like that. But before we do that, I'm going to take care of the clutch release bearing, the fork, the input shaft, get everything cleaned up in here. That's how we remove the dual mass flywheel and self-adjusting clutch on a G56. Okay, Tim, go ahead and spin that bearing. 99,000 miles. Now remember, this bearing is turning continuously. There is no free play. That slave cylinder pushes on it with the spring inside of the slave cylinder, creates preload, bearing turns. Engine's running, bearing is turning. This is the adapter plate on the back of the engine that the flywheel bolts to. Here's the barring tool coming through, and you can see how when you rotate that, it will pick up the ring gear and rotate the engine for us. And up here, this hole, that's where we put the socket through to get all 8 bolts out that we're holding the flywheel onto this adapter plate. We are going to reutilize all of these original equipment features with our system, starting with the flywheel pilot. This pilot locates the flywheel on the crankshaft. That's not the pilot for the input shaft, that's for the flywheel. We're going to use the same holes out here and drive our flywheel. We're going to use the barring tool again to rotate into position. We're going to put the bolts in right through here. So all I did was clean this up a little bit. This is ready to install, put the system back together. I took a few minutes and cleaned the transmission up. In particular, I want the guide tube, the part where the clutch release bearing slides, to be very clean, no rust, and I put a light film of high temperature wheel bearing grease on there. A little bit of high temperature wheel bearing grease on the ball stud. Now the fork, the old fork where the bearing push on the fork right here, we were starting to get some flat spots. So we got a new fork. There's a little bit of grease right there where the fork pushes on the back of the bearing on both ears. Now I underlined the part number just so you can see it easily, but this part number goes in the lower left-hand corner as you're viewing it. Very, very important. The clutch release bearing, the hole in the middle of the bearing, has a groove in it. It's called a grease groove. Please make sure the grease groove gets filled up with grease. Touch it up a little bit if you have to with high temperature wheel bearing grease. A light film of grease on the bearing where it slides. Very, very important. Then slide it on. There we go. Get it on the ball stud. Now all I have to do is put the clip back on, and the bearing and the fork looks pretty good. We include a pack of spline lubricant with each kit, and it's just like a high temperature wheel bearing grease, but there's not very much there. We don't want to get it all over everything. So I just want to take that grease, distribute it across the spline. I'm going to take the packet, kind of fold it up and make a little spreader, a little spatula. I'm going to draw it down in between each of the 10 teeth on there and distribute the grease. The grease is there to help prevent the formation of corrosion. If this input shaft and disc spline start to rust together, then it doesn't slide freely for release. So taking a minute to make sure this input shaft is clean and just a very, very light film of grease, that's time well spent. By the way, anti-seize is not the correct product right here. Anti-seize just flings off and hits the friction material, and that's not good. So, clean, greased, grease under the grease groove, little dab of grease where the fork touches the ear, little dab of grease underneath the fork pockets, and notice the clip is on, so this is ready. Now this is the clutch that we're going to install today. Comes with the flywheel, disc, pilot bearing, clutch cover, all pre-assembled. The bolts are torqued. We do all of that right here at the factory. We also include a new release bearing, those 2 handle bolts that we're going to use, that barring tool, and just as a courtesy with the kit, an alignment tool. Now it also comes with specific instructions just for installing this kit, just the way you're seeing in this video. And this is the engine side of our clutch and flywheel system. There's the 2 lifting bolts installed. So now all we got to do is lift it up onto the input shaft. Okay, so by carefully lining it up, just slide it on, and now that entire clutch is installed on the input shaft. To install the transmission, you can actually come up about as close as you can without anything touching, and then just start raising it up. Always watching your angles. Positioned against other parts. Now we just get to insert this round pilot plug into a round hole. catching the exhaust bracket, so I'm going to clear that a little bit and swing back over. That was with the ear of the transmission. Now, just by carefully guiding the transmission in, lining up the pilot of the flywheel into the engine, making sure that we get the transmission case on the dowel sleeves correctly, not pulling anything on with any bolts, just guided it up in there, got it to seat against the engine. I'm ready to start putting the rest of these bolts in. Now we're going to take a closer look at the parts that were removed from the truck. And the first thing we see is a little bit of spring tip wear right there. Not unusual. This is a self-adjusting clutch. These springs are part of that self-adjusting system. As the system compensates for wear, the spring length expands like this. Again, normal wear so far. On the friction side of the casting of the pressure plate, we've got some wear. It's not really deep hot spots. There's a little bit of hot spotting going on, but this is the kind of wear that you would expect to see from a truck that has been used, worked for over 99,000 miles. So, looks good. Here's the clutch disc. Torsion damper is intact. Friction material is intact. There's no contamination. And there's still quite a bit of wear left on this disc. Looks pretty good though. Now the dual mass flywheel. This side right here that carries the clutch itself, this is called the secondary. And if you inspect one of these on the bench or on the truck, you'll notice that it moves a little bit. And that movement is part of how this dual mass flywheel works. So I drilled this one apart. We take the secondary off. And you can see we've got pretty much that matching wear pattern from the pressure plate. Showing a little bit of heat, some work. It's uniform, looks good, and no contamination. Now inside, I drilled it apart, and there's a spring plate that holds the torsion damper down with the rivets. When I took it apart, notice a couple things unusual as I drilled it apart and actually removed it. We found some broken rivets. 3 of the rivets were actually broken. The 4th one kind of came apart as I was taking it apart, but all the others had to be drilled out. So that was a bit of a surprise. Now, the owner also reported that he had a noise during shutdown. So when we looked at the flywheel and actually turned the secondary over and look at it, you can see on the back side here, because we had 3 broken rivets, there's 3 tracks, 1, 2, 3, where the rivet had been running back and forth in that track. And I think this is where some of the noise came from during shutdown. So we actually had some rivets broken in this original equipment dual mass flywheel. Well, the clutch installation is complete. Took it for a test drive, passed all my criteria with flying colors. Wanted to go over a couple of points. I did wind up taking the transfer case off to remove and replace the transmission. Made it a little bit easier. The transmission was getting to be a little bit bulky. The bolts. These are the bolts that hold the entire clutch flywheel system onto the adapter plate on the back of the engine. They're metric, but they also have a thin, low-profile head. If you damage one of these bolts, if you lose one of these bolts and replace it with a standard metric bolt, it's going to have a taller head and it's going to hit the inside of that case on the back of the engine. So please be very careful with these. When you put your socket on to remove and replace these, make sure it's squarely and fully seated. Don't have it come in at an angle. You'll round these edges over, and then that's a lot more work for you. This particular clutch installs differently than just about any other type there is, so please take a few minutes, read the instructions, scan them, give us a call. We'll walk you through any detailed points you have about this. If you have any questions about a clutch installation, clutches, hydraulic release systems, or a flywheel, please call Perfection at 800-258-8312. Press 4. Your call will be routed directly to technical support. We'll be glad to take your call and help you out.